folks. This is your host, Sharlee Dixon. Before we get started today, we would really like your help. Please rate and review our podcast with 5 stars and make sure to share it with a friend. By spreading the word, you help us grow and reach more people, allowing others to discover the valuable insights shared in each episode. Thank you so much for being an important part of the Behavioral Health Today community.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Sharlee Dixon, and joining me today is Peter Fenger. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Sharlee. I'm usually in a different role when we record together, so I'm honored and excited to join you as co-host and excited about our show today.
Awesome. Well, welcome back to another Bytes episode where we break down mental health and societal trends into quick, digestible conversations, keeping things informative, relaxed, and relevant. Today, we're tackling a topic that directly impacts millions of families: the ongoing debate between public and charter schools. Education plays a critical role in shaping a child's future. But as charter schools gain popularity, they raise big questions about funding, resources, and student success. Some see them as a much needed innovation, while others argue they drain public schools of vital support, leaving students behind. So, what's really at stake? How do these differences affect students, teachers, and parents? And what should families consider when they're weighing these options? Let's dive into the conversation. So, at its core, public schools and charter schools are generally both public. They are funded largely by public funds, mostly on a state level. After that, the changes do start to occur. So, like I mentioned, both funded by the state. And with the public school, those funds are managed mainly by each school district's Board of Education. Well, with a charter school, they don't necessarily have that same traditional board of education for each type of school. It is really like a charter agreement or a contract that is set between the state, the school's board or board of members. And so they are run quite differently. Of course, that offers for different levels of flexibility. The schools are able to function a bit differently, but that also can create some level of conflict of interest, right? So
Sure.
public schools have to educate every child that shows up, no matter what they show up with, no matter what they show up without. They educate everybody that shows up at the door that lives within that zone or that area. But with a charter school, it is done mainly on a lottery basis, which sounds great. Everybody has equal access, right? That's what it would seem. But
Right.
that's not quite it. And in my personal experience, I applied to a charter school, but I was not chosen. My child wasn't chosen to attend. And they said that it was based on siblings that were going into that same grade level.
Hmm.
So because the family has older children there, then the younger siblings are automatically let in based on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's also looks at that board of education for that charter school. If let's say they have a child or they have a family friend, they get in quicker than a family does just applying to get in. Those changes start to show. And while they might be small, they can really impact how a child receives their education.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that you bring up that detail because I did think about this, right? You have two children,
Mhm.
and if you have to put in a lottery, where do you put those two children? If,
Right.
is there a chance of one getting into public and one getting into charter? Makes a lot of sense that they have that priority. I imagine that that's pretty easy for families. But
Yep.
if it also extends to maybe like relational, like this is a friend of mine, therefore
Yep.
there's some status that's involved, I think you're starting to get into a little bit of a class shift.
Right, right. And then it starts to be more of a nepotism type of thing
Hmm.
and not just an open lottery for whoever happens to get chosen. It's
Right.
it's a bit different there. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Very
Yep.
interesting.
Yep. Yep. And so while I agree that they are an awesome alternative, there are definitely differences in the child's learning experience as well. So
Yes.
first thing that people talk about in school period is class size. So
Hmm.
In a public school, like I mentioned, there is no cap. I mean, it is limitless, and as many children show up, they split them up between the teachers. I mean, there's no way to say you can only have 25. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But with those charters, that is part of the appeal is that there is a only a set number of students per class, which is where
Mhm.
the lottery system does come from.
Right.
So just that alone does kind of sway your opinion that charter schools are better just because the class sizes are smaller.
Right. And teachers have access to connect
Right.
with their children on a more individual basis than, say, a public school.
Right, right. And then again, that flexibility is there
Mhm.
as well. So you weren't just looking at a smaller class size, you're looking at a smaller class where the teacher has some level of flexibility in how she teaches the children the same information, so to speak, but she's
Right.
able to do some things different with her curriculum or his curriculum.
Right. And I sort of understand that charter schools have a little bit more independence on the type of curriculum that they deliver. I understand that some perspectives of charter schools will be very college focused. So there's sort of a benefit in that way. Like they can prepare their students for college prep in a different
Yep.
way that public schools can go as well.
Yep.
But I also understand that there's a difference in maybe the teacher's qualifications.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, like I mentioned before, many charter schools have a specific focus. So you might find
Mhm.
one that is the college prep school for the that section of charter schools, or
Mhm.
one that is more STEM focused, or one that is more medically focused. So they are able to tailor the student's education to exactly what that child went to school to do. Not to say
Mhm.
that they don't have the same basic testing focuses, because standardized testing is across the board for all types of schools, but it does give a different level of flexibility in curriculum, for teachers to be able to choose from.
Sure, sure. I mean, in your own experience, have you seen children succeed from charter schools more often than public schools, or is like that not really the case?
Mm,
If you're creating a charter school and it's focused around college prep, do
yeah.
you have more college accepted students than say, a public school? I mean, again, kind of hard to argue because it's not apples to apples, it's apples
Right.
and oranges.
Right, right. Yeah, I don't necessarily have the research in front of me on that particular
Mhm.
thing, but I would
Sure.
assume if parents are choosing to send their child to the college prep charter school, then there would
Mhm.
be a higher emphasis on it. But at the
Right.
same time, that charter school may not have the same connections that a
Yes.
public school may have. Every high school that I worked in, it's been a couple, they all had, or the school district itself had a
Mhm.
program with the local community college so that students were able to enroll and be dually enrolled in high
Mhm.
school and those college prep classes at the same time. I don't
Yeah.
know that charter schools have that same level of access to be able to prepare the children that want that
Mhm.
level of education. I'm not sure
Mhm.
that they have those same types of connections.
Yeah, that was my experience as well, and I found, the students that did attend those college courses really enjoyed the experience.
Mhm.
Like, I know that high school isn't for everybody, and so having that
Yep.
alternative was a great way to keep them engaged in public school, but then also
Right.
offering an alternative.
Right, right. And speaking of alternatives, I didn't even think about this till you said it. But speaking of alternatives, most of the high schools that I've worked in, they were all public, and the students were able to choose a trade school to participate
Mm,
in what as well. So I
mhm,
had students in one school that I worked in, they would get bused to the local trade school, and they would come out with certificates and things like welding,
yes,
or on the way to getting their CDL or cosmetology licenses. And so they're able
yes,
to do both of those things. And like you said, not every child is going to go to a 4-year college, but it
mhm,
also gives them that leg up in just a different type of work that they may want to enter after high school.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was my experience as well, and I do know that there's, like, a degree of certification that does come out of it. I am not aware that charter schools have that access.
Right. And in my research, I did not find any. Not
Hmm.
to say that they aren't. So
Right.
excuse me, charter school supporters. I'm not, swayed any direction, but I did not see where there was and in the charter school I've seen in my area, I did not see
Sure.
where they connected with our local community college so that students could either go for that trade or take
Mhm.
just those first 2 years of, basic English and math type credits and be able to graduate with an associate's degree or some form of certification, to use
Sure.
later. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. In your experience, how do you feel that the child development is different between the two institutions? From a public school standpoint, you really get a whole breadth of children, but a charter school can be a little bit more developed, but I also am aware that discipline is handled differently.
Right. That's where it can vary so greatly. And
Mhm.
on one hand, you will see a lot of children from different diverse backgrounds in a public school if you live in a diverse area.
Mhm.
That is the key. Where the zoning is, it really would determine like where we live now is a little less diverse than where we used to live. So my
Mhm.
child does see different levels of diversity with just a change in where we moved. He does go to public school. But in my research, I found it interesting that in charter schools, there is actually a higher level of diversity, just
Huh.
very interesting to me. I would not
Interesting.
have thought that, right?
Yeah.
But I think some of that does come from that most charter schools are just physically placed in cities and in
Mhm.
suburbs that are right outside of a city. So I do think that that plays a part.
I'm also aware that charter schools can be landing spots for students that either get suspended or opt out from public school. So
Mhm.
that too might contribute to that population as well.
Absolutely. Or
Yeah.
even just some families are just even less trusting of the public school system.
Yes.
And so I
Mhm.
think that that tends to be in a more diverse population. So I think that that's why families tend to go that way and opt for more of an open environment. You mentioned discipline policies.
Yes.
Charters generally do have greater flexibility in designing
Mhm.
their own discipline policy, but at the
Mhm.
same time, because it is not a situation where a child has to attend school there, they may be less likely to accept children that have more challenging discipline backgrounds.
Yeah, I've also heard the opinion that because they run their disciplinary programs across all students, that it can become particularly challenging for those with special needs being
Right.
held at that same disciplinary level.
Absolutely. And I wanted to bring up just the children that do have special needs and operate with an IEP or with a
Yes.
504. I,
Mhm.
I don't know that they have those same federal guidelines that say you must educate in this way.
Sure.
Now, some of
Yeah.
them may be better at handling that in a charter school setting, but in a public school, you must follow certain rules. And I don't
Mhm.
know that those rules are just as enforceable in a charter school.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Whether you're a longtime or first time listener to Behavioral Health Today, you're probably familiar with Triad, the company that brings you this podcast. But you may not know that Triad also hosts a community for current and aspiring behavioral and mental health professionals, featuring trending content and education and career resources, all for free. If you are a behavioral or mental health professional, or you're studying to become one, join more than 80,000 people on Triad by claiming your free professional account today. Visit us at hellotriad.com/BHT. That's hellotriad.com/BHT and join the Triad community today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
I want to ask you, in your own experience, have you seen the popularity of charter schools increase? Like over these past couple of years, like have you seen just the popularity of charter schools sort of balloon?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the charter school movement really gained prominence in the early 1990s. So, they aren't necessarily a new thing, but at that time there was really only one or two in two states. It wasn't everywhere. But now there are charter schools in all 50 states and in the District of Columbia. So, they are literally everywhere we look. And I agree with you, just in my experience working in education for 14 years or so, when I
Yeah.
started in the area that I worked in, there was one charter school, and
Yeah.
now there are about 10 that service the
Wow.
same area.
There,
But
yeah.
yeah, so I do think that they have ballooned, and I think it part of that is because it allows for, like I said, a certain level of flexibility,
Hmm.
smaller class sizes. I do think since COVID, parents understand that that level of more personalized attention
Mm.
is it can be very important. Some children just need that more one-on-one
Sure.
experience with a teacher.
Sure. And we've seen, trends from some of the guests that come on our show talking about how kids are entering school socially underdeveloped. And
Yeah.
so to really address it in that way is sort of a solution.
It is, and it
Yeah.
definitely can be a great solution for a child that does not do well with like my child has 25 students in his class. He's in the 5th
Mhm.
grade. Not everybody can handle being around 24 other different little minds and bodies and ideas. Even for some
Mm.
teachers, it's overwhelming. Like it really
Yes.
is. So some children just generally do better, but the other side of that is what if you don't make the lottery?
Yes. Hmm.
So
Yeah, that's
it
tough.
doesn't educate everybody equally.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as charter schools have sort of increased in popularity, I know that state funding is also affected,
It
and
is.
state funding also affects school funding. And the
Absolutely.
way I understand it is public schools are paid based off of the students that attend.
Yep.
And if you have a area where your public school is now being divided, their population is being divided by other charter schools in that area, that
Mhm.
means that you're receiving less students in your classroom, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the property value of the school has gone down. It doesn't mean that the teachers are getting paid any less. It means that you're just working with a smaller group of resources in order to support your population. Have you sort
Absolutely.
of seen that impact in your
Yeah,
experience with the schools
I
and sort
definitely
of the
have.
access to resources? Like, what did that look like to you?
Absolutely. And even stepping back a little bit from my personal experience, it's not like states started giving more money to education. That's not what
Yes.
happened. They
Mhm.
just took the money that was already there and started splitting it up even further. And so we start to see, or I saw schools that were heavily funded, by the community, they started to spend their funds in other schools. Not to say that that's a bad thing. It just caused, some issues with trying to provide the same level of resources and
Yeah.
services for children because now they're split among other schools. And let's say Johnny goes to a charter school now. Let's say his dad was a major supporter of the booster club for the football team. Now all
Right.
those booster club funds are now going to a different school. And so that school, the
Yeah.
public school, has to look for more funding sources to
Mm.
do the same thing that they used to do before.
Yeah, it really kind of poses a difficult challenge where
Mhm.
how can we support every child's needs
Right.
when we now have so many options and ways to sort of split up the resources that are
Right.
available?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, it's
And you kind
tricky.
of
And I don't know if there's like an immediate solution to this. It doesn't mean like, hey, we have to shut down these charter schools. Just ask us to ask more questions about how we can receive funding and or
right,
how resources can get allocated.
right, and how to make one the entrance into those schools a bit more equitable, and
Yes.
then
Hmm.
make sure that the funding isn't split any further because the public school still needs the funding. Just because another school opened up down the road does not mean that the students that attend the public school are less important.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
earlier
Yeah.
you mentioned something, and I didn't get to address it. So I want to talk about it now. Is teachers. What does
Yes.
the difference in the public and charter schools, what does that mean for teachers? What I
Hmm.
found to be, I guess, not necessarily super uninteresting, but teachers in charter schools tend to have less years of experience, which is interesting to me. And
Yeah.
teachers in public schools, and it probably because the public schools have been around, and so the teachers are in those public schools and they stick with them. But I do
Yes.
think some of that has to do with class size as well. Teachers want to teach smaller class sizes, but at the same time, charter school pay for teachers is not the same as pay for teachers in the public school system. Um,
Yeah, and I guess I want to ask your opinion about it. Are you
mhm,
finding that the pay for charter schools is higher than in public? Or the other thing I've also seen is that there's a degree of unions that teachers
yes.
have access to in the public setting.
In the public school system, the pay scales are set by the state's school board of education. Most of
Mhm.
them you can just Google it and find out what it is. It is generally standard based on years of experience. Most states pay by degree as well. But in
Mhm.
the charter school system, that's not really the case. You actually, teachers, in my experience, get paid a bit less in that charter school system, mainly because they don't receive all of the funding that the public school does.
Mm.
So you get some benefits. So it's a smaller class size. You do have more flexibility, but then
Right.
you're not necessarily paid on the same scale, and the benefits may not be the same. So, and I mean
Yes.
benefits like insurance, but also retirement and state benefits and pensions, those things,
Yes.
because the charter school is not in that state supported system, the
Mhm.
teachers on that level don't get it.
Sure, yeah, and I know that there's, like, a degree of job security as well that comes with
Right.
being part of a union.
It does.
So,
It
yeah,
does.
which is why you find teachers with multiple years of experience, and then you go
Yep.
into a charter school, and that might vary
Right,
based
right.
off the
Because if
teacher.
I've put in, let's say I've been a teacher for 20 years and I'm going to retire at 25, I'm not going to leave the public school. Even if I have issues there, I'm not going to leave to go to the charter school, make less money. Now I have no pension. And then I also don't have access to a union. Of course, all states don't offer unions for their teachers, which is unfortunate, but different subject. But the states that do have unions available, charter school teachers are not a part of those unions. They have
Mm.
less job security. And on top of that, there's less, or could be less, support for the teachers as well, because unions aren't just about the job security, but you can call up your union rep and say, hey, this isn't happening the way that it should, and you have a
Yes.
certain level of support. But in charter
Yeah.
schools, it's not there.
Yeah. I want to ask you about burnout because I know that, there are a lot of teachers that are having a difficult time and curriculum itself it's very challenging for teachers. And the perspective I'm coming from is really from a public school perspective. But
Yeah.
do you know if the burnout, maybe employment cycle, rotating doors of teachers is the same in a charter school as well?
Interesting question. I actually have friends in the new area that we moved to that are
Yeah.
teachers in a charter school. I did not have any in the area we were in before, but the
Mhm.
teachers there say, yes, I get paid less. You're right about that. I do get paid less,
Mhm.
but they talk about a different level of job satisfaction than
Mhm.
many of my public school friends do. And so I don't know if that does equate, or if it comes as a result of the flexibility of the class size. Honestly, I think it also has a lot to do with parental involvement. At a charter school, it is an inherent thing. It is not necessarily a written policy in all schools, but most do have some form of policy that the parents must either volunteer in the school, they must spend a certain amount of hours in the school each school year. So the
Mm.
parents are around more. And so it's
Mm.
not just like, here you go, here's the kids, you do the rest. In a charter
Sure.
school, they are a part of the entire process.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. No, I can
Yep.
imagine how integrating some of those values that really, encourage relationship, connection,
Mhm.
strong family values within the
Yep.
school can be really beneficial to the child's experience. So,
Absolutely.
it's a great detail that a charter school can offer, but I'm sure that there are ways that public schools are sort of encouraging that in their own way as well.
There are
Yeah.
definitely, every school I've ever worked in has worked almost overtime to get parents involved, to get parents
Yes.
coming to the school. And the only time that I ever saw that it wasn't as much of parent involvement was during COVID, and mainly because we just couldn't. We weren't
Yes.
there ourselves. And then so it's harder to get parents involved when you can't invite them into the building. But most schools I've ever worked in had an open door policy like, oh, if you want to come in, come to the school, come do what you need to do, come to this parent program, come hang out at lunch. So most schools are doing, I think, their best to try to get more involvement in with the parents. But speaking
Mhm.
of parents, I do think it can be a difficult choice to choose, between, do I go with a public school? Do I
Yes.
go with a charter school? And to those parents, I would say just do your research. It takes a lot of time to really consider all the important things, like, does my child
Mhm.
have any type of educational challenge? Do they have a behavioral type of challenge? I tell parents to visit those schools and see what it feels like when you go there. Give it a vibe check. Like, what does it really feel like? What do you see the children doing? Like, are all the children just quiet and silent, and oftentimes that's not necessarily indicative of learning. Like, are they involved though? Are they talking to their teachers? Are their teachers open to them? It is hard to give it a one size fits all type of thing because they're going to be different. But there are some things to consider for parents as they make those choices, and teachers as well, as they make those choices and weighing, which one is going to be the best for them and their family.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's a very black or white choice. It
Not.
really seems like it is very specific to your area
Mhm.
as well as very specific to the charter school and how they're ran.
So, so the debate over public versus charter schools isn't just about policy, as we've talked about here. It's about the future of education. Both have pros and cons, but competition for funding and resources affects students, teachers, and our larger community. As education changes, parents must stay informed and choose what's best for their child. Instead of asking which model is better, the real question is, how do we ensure every student gets the quality education they deserve? Thanks for joining us on this episode of BHT Bytes, and we'll see you next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.